We begin with the recognition that sociology, as a science, stands at the threshold of understanding human association and the processes by which individuals are bound together in enduring forms of life. The preface must necessarily set forth the conviction that the materials of sociology are already abundant in the records of human history and the observation of daily life. What has been lacking is not the subject matter, but the point of view by which scattered observations might be unified and brought within the range of systematic interpretation. This book seeks to provide the beginning of such a framework, not with the finality of a completed system, but with the humility of an initial effort to assemble the instruments and categories by which later generations may move toward a more comprehensive science. The study of society is not new, for from the earliest times philosophers have speculated on the order of human life, the laws that govern collective action, and the means by which men seek to regulate their relations with one another. What distinguishes the sociological undertaking of our time from those earlier reflections is the attempt to make the investigation empirical and the method scientific. We no longer rest content with broad generalizations on the nature of man, but turn to the records of behavior, the statistics of population, the observation of communities, and the study of institutions as they arise, change, and dissolve under the pressure of circumstance. The task of sociology is thus to give order to the facts of association, to reveal the forms by which human relations are sustained, and to disclose the processes by which new adjustments are achieved when old arrangements break down. The introduction to this science must emphasize that sociology, though young, aspires to the dignity of the natural sciences. Its object is not the individual in isolation, but the individual as a participant in a larger whole, whose actions derive meaning only in relation to the actions of others. The subject matter is society, and society is not merely a sum of persons, but a web of interactions, of responses and counter-responses, of agreements and conflicts, which together constitute the life of the group. It is this complex that the sociologist must analyze and describe, tracing the recurrent forms and discovering the laws by which they are maintained or transformed. At the foundation of sociology lies the recognition that human behavior is not solely determined by instincts, nor wholly the product of rational choice. Man is plastic, capable of learning, open to suggestion, and responsive to the influences of his fellows. It is precisely this openness that makes social life possible. Through communication, men transmit ideas, values, and sentiments, and by means of imitation they adopt the customs that prevail in their community. Out of these processes arise institutions, traditions, and the entire fabric of culture. To study these is to study sociology at its core. The nature of sociology may be further clarified by contrasting it with other disciplines. Economics concerns itself with the production and distribution of goods, political science with the organization of power, psychology with the mental processes of individuals. Sociology, however, embraces the wider field in which all these activities are embedded. It seeks to understand the framework within which economic, political, and religious institutions take form, the conditions under which they flourish, and the forces by which they decay. In this sense, sociology is the science of collective behavior, a study of the processes by which the many are woven into a pattern that has coherence and duration. When we speak of the fundamental problems of sociology, we refer to the great questions that have confronted every attempt to interpret society. Chief among these is the problem of order. How is it that a multitude of individuals, each with his own desires and impulses, come to act in ways that are consistent and predictable? What holds the group together in the face of centrifugal tendencies that constantly threaten to dissolve it? The answers must be sought in the mechanisms of social control, in the habits and institutions that channel conduct, and in the sanctions, moral and legal, that enforce conformity. It is by means of these that society secures a measure of stability and transmits its culture across generations. Yet order is not the whole of the matter, for society is never static. Change is as fundamental as stability, and the second great problem is to understand the processes of transformation. Conflict, migration, invention, and diffusion introduce novelty and disturb the established order. Out of the clash of old and new arise new accommodations, new institutions, new patterns of life. The sociologist must therefore concern himself not only with the forces that preserve, but with the forces that disrupt and reconstruct. To understand both is to grasp the dialectic of social existence. The materials for the study of these problems are as varied as the forms of human association themselves. The life of the family, the organization of the city, the activities of the church, the interplay of races and classes, all furnish examples of the processes at work. The student of sociology must learn to see beneath the surface of these phenomena, to detect the underlying principles that recur in different guises. He must recognize that the forms of association, however diverse, are variations upon a few basic types, and that the laws of interaction, though obscured by circumstance, are universal in scope. The scientific temper requires that we resist the temptation to impose our own valuations upon the facts. Sociology does not exist to justify existing institutions, nor to condemn them. Its purpose is to understand. Judgment belongs to ethics and politics. The sociologist must be content to describe the forms of association, to trace their development, and to seek the causal relations that explain their persistence or decline. In this sense, sociology is a positive science, concerned with what is rather than what ought to be. Only by maintaining this detachment can it achieve the objectivity that science demands. Nevertheless, sociology cannot but have implications for practice. By disclosing the conditions under which order is maintained or disrupted, it provides insight into the problems of policy and reform. The legislator, the educator, the social worker, all may profit from its findings. Yet the utility of sociology is incidental to its scientific aim. It is not a program for social engineering, but a body of knowledge upon which such programs may draw. As we proceed, we must guard against the illusion that society is a thing apart from individuals. Society has no existence save in and through the conduct of its members. What the sociologist studies is the interaction of persons, the currents of influence that pass among them, and the collective products that emerge from their cooperation. In this respect, the individual and society are not opposed, but complementary. The individual is shaped by the group, and the group exists only in the actions of individuals. This reciprocity is the key to sociological understanding. A further fundamental problem is the relation between the biological and the social. Man is an animal, subject to instincts, appetites, and physical limitations. Yet he is also a social being, whose behavior is modified by custom and guided by symbols. The transition from the merely biological to the distinctively social marks the field of sociology. To trace this transition, to show how natural impulses are transformed into social habits, is one of its essential tasks. In this way, sociology mediates between biology and psychology on the one hand and history and economics on the other. The method of sociology must be adapted to its subject matter. It cannot be confined to controlled experiments as in the physical sciences, for human behavior resists artificial isolation. Instead, it relies upon observation of natural situations, upon historical comparison, upon the analysis of statistical data, and upon the careful interpretation of documents and records. These methods, though indirect, yield results of scientific value when pursued with rigor. The accumulation of such results is gradually building up a body of generalizations that constitute the beginnings of sociological theory. The sociologist must cultivate the habit of viewing events in their wider context. He must see how an individual act is related to the group situation, how a custom arises from repeated responses to common needs, how an institution embodies the accumulated experience of generations. This breadth of vision distinguishes the sociological from the merely personal or moral interpretation of events. It requires that we think in terms of processes rather than isolated acts, of systems rather than fragments. It is important also to recognize the place of the city in the development of sociology. The city, with its concentration of population, its diversity of occupations, and its constant interchange of influences, presents the social processes in their most visible and dramatic form. The problems of social order, of conflict, of accommodation, are here displayed in miniature, offering the sociologist a laboratory for the study of human association. Much of the data upon which modern sociology is based is drawn from urban life, and the city will continue to be the field in which its theories are tested. To sum up, the foundations of sociology rest upon the recognition that human life is essentially social, that the forms of association are subject to analysis, and that the processes of change and adaptation can be understood scientifically. The fundamental problems are those of order and change, of the relation of the individual to the group, and of the interaction of biological and social factors. The method is empirical, drawing upon observation and analysis rather than speculation alone. And the aim is to build a body of knowledge that will make intelligible the complex fabric of society. The student who embarks upon the study of sociology must be prepared for patience, for the accumulation of facts is slow and the formulation of general laws more tentative than final. But he may take confidence from the conviction that sociology is moving toward maturity, that each generation contributes to its growth, and that the science of society, though still in its infancy, has already begun to illuminate the world in which we live. The task is large, the difficulties many, but the promise is commensurate with the effort. For to understand society is to understand ourselves, and in that understanding lies the hope of more rational and humane adjustment of men to one another in the future. Society is held together by mechanisms that are at once simple and profound. If we examine the conduct of individuals in their daily intercourse, we observe that they do not act at random, but in ways that are determined by the responses of others. Every gesture calls forth an answering gesture, every word is matched by a reply, every initiative encounters a reaction that in turn becomes a stimulus for further action. It is in this chain of stimulus and response that we discern the mechanism of social life. The individual lives not as a self-enclosed unit, but as a participant in a continuous interaction, in which his conduct is shaped by the expectations, the suggestions, and the demands of those about him. At the most elementary level, these mechanisms may be seen in the instinctive tendencies that man shares with other animals. Hunger, sex, fear, anger, and the impulse to companionship are the raw materials upon which society works. These impulses, left to themselves, would produce only disorderly and conflicting behavior. Yet through habit and suggestion they are directed into channels that make cooperation possible. The instinct to imitate, the readiness to be impressed by the example of others, furnishes the basis for conformity to custom. The instinct to communicate through cries, gestures, and symbols provides the means by which ideas are transmitted and sentiments shared. Out of these elementary tendencies, guided and organized by the pressure of the group, there emerges a system of habits that constitute the mechanism of society. It is important to recognize that social life is possible only because human nature is plastic. The instincts of man do not bind him in rigid patterns, but permit a wide range of variation. He can learn new ways, adapt himself to new situations, and acquire new values. This capacity to learn is the condition of culture. Through education, imitation, and participation in the life of the group, the individual becomes endowed with the traditions, the standards, and the modes of conduct that distinguish his society. Thus, the mechanism of society is not imposed from without, but is built up through the gradual transformation of native impulses into acquired habits. Among the most significant of these mechanisms is language. By means of words, men are able not only to communicate immediate needs and feelings, but to convey ideas, to preserve experience, and to coordinate their actions across time and space. Language makes possible the organization of labor, the transmission of culture, and the development of institutions. It binds the present with the past and projects the influence of the group into the future. Without language, there could be no history, no science, no law. It is the great social instrument by which the scattered impulses of individuals are brought into coherent patterns of cooperation. Another mechanism is custom. Customs are the established ways of acting that arise from repeated responses to recurrent situations. They embody the experience of the group, conserving what has proved useful and transmitting it to succeeding generations. The individual, born into a world of customs, finds his conduct largely prescribed by patterns that he did not create. Yet in conforming to these he secures the approval of his fellows and avoids the sanctions that are visited upon deviance. Custom thus functions as a conservative force, maintaining stability and continuity in social life. At the same time, customs are not immutable. They change as new conditions arise, though always with a certain inertia that resists innovation. Suggestion, too, plays a vital role. Man is peculiarly susceptible to influence. The mere presence of others modifies his behavior. He is stirred by their emotions, persuaded by their opinions, guided by their example. This responsiveness to suggestion explains the rapid spread of fashions, the contagion of enthusiasm, and the sway of public opinion. It is through suggestion that leaders exercise control over followers, that crowds are swept by passion, and that communities are mobilized for action. Suggestion, therefore, is both a unifying and a disruptive force, capable of producing harmony or hysteria, cooperation or conflict. Imitation is closely allied to suggestion. In the presence of a model, whether person or institution, individuals reproduce the patterns they observe. Children learn to speak by imitating the sounds of their elders. Workers acquire skill by copying the methods of their masters, and whole peoples adopt the customs of more prestigious cultures. Imitation is selective, guided by interest and prestige, but in all its forms it is a powerful mechanism by which social life is perpetuated and diversified. It is through imitation that traditions are handed down, but also through imitation that innovations spread and societies transform themselves. Behind all these mechanisms lies the fact of human nature. By human nature we mean the sum of those tendencies and capacities with which man is endowed by virtue of his biological constitution. These include not only the instincts that impel him to act, but the capacities for learning, for communication, and for reflection that make him educable. Human nature is not a fixed essence, but a set of potentialities, which take form only in interaction with the environment. It is the foundation upon which society builds, but it is not society itself. The mistake of earlier theorists was to suppose that human nature alone could explain social life. In truth, it is only through participation in the group that the individual realizes his nature. The child at birth is a bundle of impulses, without language, without self-consciousness, without moral standards. Only through contact with others does he acquire these. He learns to speak the language of his group, to adopt its gestures, to internalize its values. He becomes, in short, a person. Human nature provides the capacity for speech, but society furnishes the vocabulary. Human nature provides the capacity for sympathy, but society teaches whom to love and whom to hate. Human nature provides the capacity for belief, but society determines what is believed. Thus, the individual is at once the bearer of human nature and the product of social experience. The social person is, therefore, a creation of society. He is not merely an individual organism, but an individual endowed with a social self. This self arises in the process of interaction. We come to know ourselves as we are reflected in the attitudes of others. Their responses to our conduct give us the sense of what we are and how we are regarded. The praise or blame of companions, the approval or disapproval of the community, become incorporated into our self-image. We see ourselves as others see us, and in this reflection the social self is formed. It is not an illusion, but a reality, for it shapes our behavior, guides our aspirations, and constitutes the core of personality. The social person is also the bearer of roles. In every group, individuals occupy positions with associated expectations. The child is expected to obey, the parent to protect, the teacher to instruct, the ruler to govern. To each role are attached rights and duties, privileges and responsibilities. By performing these roles, individuals contribute to the functioning of the group and maintain their place within it. The self is thus not a solitary entity, but a constellation of roles, each defined by the network of relations in which the person is involved. The performance of roles is not mechanical, for individuals interpret and negotiate them, but the framework of roles provides the structure of social life. We may say, then, that society exists in the persons who compose it, but the persons themselves exist only as social beings. The individual is not lost in the group, but realized in it. He brings to the group his impulses and capacities, and in return he receives the meanings and values that make his life intelligible. The relation is reciprocal and dynamic. Society molds the individual, but the individual also reacts upon society, modifying its customs and influencing its development. The balance of this interaction constitutes the life process of society. If we ask why these mechanisms are effective, the answer lies in the fact that man is responsive to symbols. A symbol is a sign that has meaning, not in itself, but by common agreement. Words, gestures, flags, and rituals are symbols. Through them men evoke sentiments, arouse loyalty, and organize collective action. The symbol condenses experience, carries emotional weight, and serves as a rallying point for the group. The ability to respond to symbols is a distinctive trait of human nature, and it is upon this capacity that the whole edifice of society rests. By symbols men transcend the immediate situation, act in view of distant ends, and maintain allegiance to causes that outlive the individual. We see now that the mechanisms of society are at once biological and cultural. They are rooted in the instincts and capacities of human nature, but they are shaped and directed by the traditions and institutions of the group. Language, custom, suggestion, imitation, and the use of symbols are the means by which society perpetuates itself and transforms its members into social persons. These mechanisms operate continuously, often unconsciously, but their effects are profound. They make possible not only the preservation of order, but the enrichment of life through culture, cooperation, and the pursuit of common ends. The study of these mechanisms reveals also the limits of individual autonomy. No man is free to act as he pleases, for his actions are bound up with the expectations and reactions of others. Even his thoughts are shaped by the categories of language and the standards of his community. To understand this is not to deny individuality, but to recognize the conditions under which it arises. The individual achieves freedom not by escaping society, but by participating in it intelligently. Freedom is not the absence of restraint, but the power to act within the framework of social relations, guided by knowledge of their workings. In conclusion, human nature and social interaction are inseparable. Human nature furnishes the impulses and capacities, social interaction furnishes the forms and meanings. The social person is the product of this union, at once natural and cultural, biological and historical. To study him is to study the essence of sociology, For in him the mechanisms of society and the potentialities of human nature meet and are realized. Communication is the process by which society exists and perpetuates itself. Without communication, there could be no common understanding, no transmission of ideas, and no coordination of activities. It is through communication that isolated individuals are welded into groups, that the sentiments of the many are unified, and that the life of the group acquires continuity across generations. Communication is not confined to speech, though speech is its highest instrument. It includes every form of behavior by which one person influences another, from the simplest gesture or cry to the most elaborate system of symbols embodied in religion, law, and science. The infant responds to the smile of its mother, the soldier to the waving of a flag, the citizen to the printed word. In each case, communication is at work, creating bonds that transcend the individual and sustaining the complex fabric of social life. The power of communication lies in its ability to evoke in one mind the experience of another. By means of language, feelings and thoughts are externalized and made available to others. Words are not merely sounds, they are symbols charged with meaning, condensed expressions of past experiences, and vehicles of collective memory. When a word is spoken, it calls up in the hearer an image or sentiment akin to that of the speaker. In this way, the experiences of individuals are pooled, and the knowledge of the group grows beyond what any one person could acquire alone. Language is thus the great social instrument by which tradition is transmitted, cooperation secured, and collective purposes realized. But communication is more than the conveyance of ideas. It is also the expression of emotions and attitudes. Tone of voice, gesture, and facial expression often speak more forcefully than words. The contagion of emotion spreads rapidly through a crowd by these channels, producing enthusiasm, panic, or rage. Rituals and ceremonies are forms of communication that embody and reinforce the values of the group. Through them, the individual is reminded of his membership in a larger whole, and his loyalty is renewed. Communication, therefore, operates both at the intellectual and at the emotional level, binding men together, not only in thought but in sentiment. The printed word has extended the reach of communication beyond the limits of face-to-face contact. With the invention of writing and the development of the press, ideas could be fixed and transmitted across time and space. Newspapers, books, and pamphlets have become the chief instruments of public opinion. They make it possible for millions to share in the same discussion, to be informed of the same events, and to respond collectively to common issues. The result is the creation of a public, a body of individuals who, though scattered and unacquainted with one another, are united in attention to the same matters. This enlargement of communication has transformed society, multiplying the scale of collective action and intensifying the forces of social control. For communication is not merely a neutral process, it is the principal means by which society exerts control over its members. Through communication, norms are transmitted, values inculcated, and conformity enforced. The child learns what is right and wrong through the words of parents and teachers. The citizen learns his duties through the laws published and proclaimed by the state. Public opinion, carried by the press and voiced in assemblies, sets the boundaries of acceptable conduct. Those who violate these expectations are subjected to criticism, ridicule, or ostracism. Communication thus channels behavior, aligning individual actions with collective standards. The effectiveness of communication in securing control depends upon the fact that men seek approval and dread disapproval. The desire for recognition is one of the strongest of human motives. To be ignored is to be socially annihilated. Hence, individuals conform to the judgments expressed about them, internalizing the attitudes of others, and making these a part of their own conscience. The voice of society is heard within as the voice of duty. In this way, external communication becomes internal self-control, and the person becomes a moral agent. Accommodation is the process by which conflicts of interest and differences of attitude are adjusted, making continued association possible. Wherever men live together, conflicts arise. Desires clash, opinions differ, and competition for advantage leads to friction. If society is to endure, these conflicts must be resolved, or at least kept within bounds that permit cooperation. Accommodation is the name we give to the adjustments that accomplish this. It is not the abolition of conflict, but its regulation. Not the elimination of difference, but the establishment of tolerable relations between differing parties. Accommodation takes many forms. It may be deliberate, as in treaties between nations, contracts between individuals, or compromises in legislatures. It may also be unconscious, as when individuals fall into habits of mutual concession or develop tacit understandings about each other's rights and privileges. In either case, the result is a working arrangement that enables life to go on despite underlying tensions. Accommodation may be temporary or permanent, fragile or stable, depending on the circumstances. But without some measure of accommodation, social life would dissolve in endless strife. The institution of law is the most formal expression of accommodation. Laws codify the adjustments that society has found necessary to preserve order. They define rights and duties, prescribe procedures for settling disputes, and provide sanctions for violations. By embodying these accommodations in a system of rules, society reduces uncertainty and makes cooperation more secure. Yet law is only one form of accommodation, and often the less formal arrangements of custom and etiquette are equally important. The conventions of polite behavior, the tacit codes of honor, the unwritten rules of conduct in various circles, all serve to prevent conflict and smooth the course of interaction. Accommodation is not only a means of preserving order, but also a stage in social development. Through the process of conflict and adjustment, new norms are created and old ones modified. Each accommodation represents a balance of forces at a given time, but as conditions change, new accommodations are necessary. Thus, the history of society is a record of successive accommodations, each resolving for the moment the tensions of its era, and each giving way in turn to new adjustments. Accommodation, therefore, is dynamic, a continuing process by which society adapts itself to change while preserving its integrity. Closely related to accommodation is competition. Competition is the struggle of individuals or groups for the same object when the supply is limited. It is the effort to secure advantage over others in the pursuit of wealth, power, prestige, or any other valued goal. Unlike conflict, competition does not necessarily involve direct opposition or hostility. The contestants may not even be aware of one another. But their efforts are mutually exclusive, for the success of one means the failure of others. Competition is thus a pervasive feature of social life, shaping the distribution of opportunities and rewards. Competition serves important social functions. It stimulates effort, compelling individuals to develop their capacities and strive for excellence. It allocates resources, directing them toward those who can make the most effective use of them. It promotes differentiation, leading to the specialization of functions and the diversification of roles. In the economic sphere, competition among producers leads to innovation and efficiency. In the intellectual sphere, competition among ideas fosters critical thinking and the advance of knowledge. In politics, competition for leadership gives the people a choice among policies and prevents the concentration of power. Yet competition also has its dangers. It can produce inequality, as those with greater advantages outstrip those less favored. It can lead to waste, as energies are expended in duplicating efforts or in destructive rivalry. It can generate hostility, as the losers resent the winners and seek to retaliate. For these reasons, competition must be balanced by accommodation and controlled by regulation. When unrestrained, it undermines the very cooperation upon which society depends. When properly channeled, it becomes a source of progress and vitality. The interplay of communication, accommodation, and competition constitutes the essence of social control. Through communication, norms are established and enforced. Through accommodation, conflicts are resolved and association maintained. Through competition, energies are mobilized and resources allocated. Together they create the framework within which individuals live their lives, pursue their goals, and realize their identities as social persons. Social control is not merely the imposition of authority from above, but the outcome of countless interactions in which individuals influence and are influenced by one another. It is important to note that social control is not absolute. No society achieves perfect conformity or complete harmony. Deviations occur, conflicts persist, and inequalities remain. But through the mechanisms of communication, accommodation, and competition, these are kept within limits that preserve the cohesion of the group. The measure of a society's stability lies in the effectiveness of these mechanisms, and the measure of its vitality lies in the openness with which it accommodates change and channels competition toward constructive ends. The study of these processes reveals the profound interdependence of individuals. No one can escape the influence of communication. No one can avoid the necessity of accommodation. No one is free from the effects of competition. We are bound together in a network of relations that at once constrain and liberate us. To understand these processes is to understand the dynamics of social life, the ways in which society maintains itself, and the conditions under which it changes. For in the final analysis, society is nothing but communication organized through accommodations and energized by competition. Conflict is as fundamental a process in society as cooperation. Wherever men live together, their interests inevitably collide. Desires outstrip resources, ambitions overlap, beliefs clash, and the pursuit of advantage brings individuals and groups into opposition. Conflict is not an accidental or abnormal occurrence, but a normal expression of social life. It arises whenever two parties seek the same end that cannot be enjoyed in equal measure by both. It appears in quarrels between individuals, in rivalries among classes, in struggles among nations. It is as constant as the need for food and shelter, as enduring as the passions of men. The significance of conflict lies not only in its destructiveness, but also in its constructive role. Conflict breaks down rigidities, challenges established norms, and forces new accommodations. Without conflict, society would stagnate in unquestioned routine, incapable of adapting to changing conditions. Conflict calls forth effort, compels clarification of issues, and stimulates innovation. In the clash of opinions, truth emerges more clearly. In the struggle for rights, justice is advanced. The process is painful, often violent, but it is through conflict that societies progress and new forms of order are created. Conflict takes many forms. At the most immediate level, it appears as personal antagonism, quarrels, and disputes. In larger dimensions, it assumes the form of competition for economic advantage, political power, or social prestige. Sometimes conflict is open and direct, expressed in strikes, revolts, or wars. At other times it is latent, smoldering beneath the surface in resentments, prejudices, and rivalries that may erupt when provoked. The forms vary, but the underlying principle is the same: the pursuit of incompatible interests by different parties within the same field of association. The outcome of conflict is seldom the total annihilation of one party by the other. More often it results in some kind of settlement, whether through victory and defeat, compromise, or stalemate. This settlement may be temporary or lasting, but in any case it represents a redefinition of relations, a new balance of power. In this sense, conflict is always a prelude to some new form of order. The old equilibrium having been disturbed, a new one must be established. Thus, conflict and consensus are not opposed, but complementary processes, alternating phases in the continuous adjustment of social life. Consensus, then, is the condition of association. It refers to the common understanding, the shared values, and the mutual expectations that make cooperation possible. Consensus does not mean complete agreement on all matters, which is neither possible nor necessary. It means agreement on fundamentals, sufficient harmony of outlook to permit individuals to work together. Consensus exists in the language that all understand, in the customs that all observe, in the institutions that all respect. It is the invisible cement that holds society together, the background against which conflicts occur and are resolved. Consensus arises gradually from the interactions of individuals. As they communicate, imitate, and cooperate, they develop common standards. The repetition of similar experiences creates common sentiments. The performance of common tasks generates mutual confidence. Out of these emerges a body of traditions, beliefs, and norms that command general assent. These may be embodied in religion, law, or public opinion, but in whatever form they appear, they constitute the consensus of the group. Without such consensus, no society could endure, for there would be no basis for cooperation and no standard for judgment. Consensus is not static but dynamic. It changes as conditions change, incorporating new values and discarding old ones. Each generation renews consensus in its own way, sometimes accepting the heritage of the past, sometimes revising it. The process is never complete, for new conflicts continually arise, challenging established beliefs and forcing reconsideration. Thus, consensus and conflict are in constant interplay, each feeding into the other, each necessary to the other. Conflict without consensus would destroy society. Consensus without conflict would paralyze it. Together, they produce the rhythm of social evolution. The study of collective behavior brings these processes into sharp relief. Collective behavior refers to the actions of individuals when they are part of a crowd, a public, or a mass movement. In such situations, the normal restraints of custom and law may be loosened, and individuals act under the influence of suggestion, emotion, and contagion. The crowd is the most striking example. In a crowd, individuals lose their sense of separateness and become absorbed in a common mood. Emotions spread rapidly, excitement mounts, and actions are performed that would not occur in isolation. The crowd may be destructive, as in riots and mobs, or constructive, as in religious revivals and patriotic gatherings. In either case, it reveals the power of social influence when individuals are fused in immediate association. Public opinion is another form of collective behavior, less volatile than the crowd, but equally significant. The public arises when individuals, though scattered, are focused on the same issue and influenced by the same communications. Newspapers, speeches, and now the wider instruments of communication create a public by directing attention to common matters. Within the public, opinions are formed, debated, and crystallized. These opinions exert pressure on individuals and institutions, guiding conduct and shaping policy. Unlike the crowd, the public is more reflective, more continuous, but it too is subject to the contagion of ideas and the sway of leaders.